Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's always interesting to note when those opposite talk about hard-working, they neglect to tell you there's 3 MPs over there, and between the 3 of them have given themselves a bigger tax rise than one pensioner earns in a whole year. So when they talk about entrepreneurs, they're actually talking about lining their own pockets, not those that actually need it. Oh, they could live on $40 a day, apparently, yeah. Deputy Speaker, in the latest budget, the government has shown its true colours. It's proven once again, and as we've seen time and time before, that while we on this side of this House are about giving to Australians a fair go, they're only here to look after the top end of the town. There's not a lot to talk about when it comes to what the government hasn't funded in my electorate than what it has, because it's pretty hard to talk about nothing. Zip, zero, zilch. That's the funding this government has given to the community in this budget. Not one road, not one school, not one TAFE, not one hospital, and not one mobile phone black spot tower. Nothing. All they are doing is cutting money from workers and pensioners and giving tax cuts to their big banker mates. We've said it all before and we'll say it again. This budget does not pass the fairness test. The budget was an opportunity for the government to show the nation what they believed in, and they did that. In his last speech, Hubert H. Humphrey said, "The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of their life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy and the handicapped." The morals of this government are clearly on display with this budget. There's no secrecy, no hidden agendas. We see their priorities front and centre. They believe in backing big banks and big business over children, pensioners and working Australians, whereas we believe in the fair go. I represent one of the fastest growing regions in our nation, with Whittlesea, Mitchell Shire and Hume all being among the fastest growing local government areas in the country. Now, this growth brings with it pressures that can only be relieved by proper funding of infrastructure, school and healthcare. So we know that this government doesn't listen to anyone, and you have to sit there and you go, 1 in 5 businesses have said outright they don't need a company tax cut to secure their business future. That's businesses telling the government they don't need this tax cut. And 4 in 5 businesses are saying they won't pass on the extra profits to increase employment or increase wages. So why is the government arrogantly pushing ahead with tax cuts for multinationals and overseas investors? Because this is an ideological position. It's not one about a nation building or an economy building one. It's just their values, to look after the top end of town. It's done at a time when inequity is higher than it's ever been before. Stagnant wages and insecure work in this country are only getting worse. And not only that, the so-called tax cuts they want to give to workers won't be fully effective for about another 25 years. The Treasurer points to the 1.1 million underemployed Australians in his budget. He says himself, despite global growth being the best in 6 years, underemployment still remains elevated. So the Treasurer, after 5 years of Liberal national government, when global growth is being at its best, why is unemployment at the same rate it was when you came in? Why is wage theft and wage stagnation so high when you're telling us the economic situation is better than it was 6 years ago? Why is it you would rather fork out $80 billion to tax-dodging big businesses, including overseas investors, than fund pensioners $14 a week for a winter energy supplement? Not only did this budget not deliver a single dollar to McEwen or the rest of Australia in infrastructure, but it also admitted the government failed delivery on any infrastructure funding promised in the last budget. Down in Victoria, we've been working hard to get our fair share of funding. There's a much longer list of what hasn't been done than what has. We've been asking for the Wallen interchange, we've been asking for the E6, and we've been asking for safer and better access to our outer suburbs. 3 infrastructure ministers this year alone, and not one of them can answer a call. Instead, we are left to deal with the mess of single-lane roads and dangerous intersections, while this government commits nothing to the communities of McEwen. Even the flailing PM finally seems to understand the need to get on with the North East Link, so that we can give local roads back to local residents. This was a project Labor championed at the last election, and boy, wouldn't it be nice if the government just did one thing that was right by the McEwen residents. In the latest infrastructure priority list compiled by Infrastructure Australia, only 13 projects out of the 96 were in Victoria, and only 2 of those benefit McEwen. Yet both of those have again received no actual funding. So 2 out of 96 is simply not good enough. Unlike those opposite who came to the last election with no funding for vital roads in our communities, Labor committed $120 million to the Bridging Road complete duplication and the funding for the O'Hearns Road interchange. Why? Because we understand that growing communities need these accesses and we know how to deliver it. The government talks big on its plan, but in 5 years it hasn't delivered a thing. You could almost say it's like a Blackadder comedy. We have a cunning plan, a plan so cunning you could put a tail on it and call it a weasel. But Baldrick Treasurer is delivering nothing that actually helps our communities. And that means each and every year they deliver nothing, it gets worse and worse and worse. We get on to mobile phone black spots. Much of Australia has had a small taste this week of what happens when your mobile phone doesn't work. It's been front page news for days, but it's all too common occurrence in our communities. It's what we face each and every day. This government put not 1 cent in the budget towards a mobile phone black spot program. In fact, what it did do in the last round was mislead Australians in round 3 in delivering towers. By its own criteria, it failed to deliver, but it ensured that the money it had put aside for round 3 was put into a pork barrelling exercise for marginal Liberal and National seats. We meet every single criteria listed by the government, yet we've received 2 in 3 rounds. You need to ask why. Why did the government take taxpayer funds and fund this pork barrelling exercise at the expense of communities who can't get phone reception? Instead, 75% of the mobile phone black spot towers have been in Liberal and National seats. This means for the next 4 years, this government is not putting 1 cent towards improving coverages across Victoria. And the message to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer is the jig is up. Victorians are tired of the lack of transparency and consultation in this government's delayed backstop program. While the government turns a blind eye to the fact McEwen residents are being left off the grid, fortunately the Victorian government, the Andrews Labor government, is committing where the Turnbull government refuses to do so. Speaker, the attacks don't just stop there. The Turnbull government has had it out for young Australians from childcare all the way through to university and TAFE. Those opposite don't seem to know or don't seem to care if kids start off on the wrong foot for their very first day of childcare. Over the next 3 years, cutting $6 million from childcare early learning projects. And instead of putting that money into fixing the budget, they're putting that money into giving it to banks in the form of tax cuts. And when we look at schools, if childcare isn't bad enough, the government is cutting $17 billion from our schools as well. McEwen is one of the top 10 electorates nationwide with students attending government schools, and we know firsthand just how many kids and parents are going to be impacted by these brutal cuts. We know just how devastating these cuts will be to schools, squeezing every dollar to deliver excellent learning outcomes for our kids. While those opposite just think mummy and daddy should pay more for schools, when people can't, they're still entitled to a good quality education. That's why we will restore fair needs-based funding to all schools and put back that $17 billion the government is robbing from our kids' future. The choice is clear. Liberal government, $17 billion to the big banks. Labor government, $17 billion in education. Our TAFEs are under attack with out-of-touch ministers who have never worked a day outside of a cushy office. It's an utterly bizarre attack on TAFE. The Minister for Education actually said that funding the TAFE system is like basket weaving. With comments like that, it's no wonder the government feels so comfortable in cutting $270 million on top of the $3 billion they've already cut from TAFEs and apprenticeships. Australian trades, we've got to go.
A division has been called for the House of Representatives. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Australian trades are facing massive skill shortages, from carpenters to bricklayers to bakers and pastry cooks. But despite high unemployment, this government's cuts means that workers can't learn the skills the industries are crying out for. But I wonder if the Prime Minister ever thought, who's going to build his 5th, 6th or 7th investment property? That's why we are committed to putting $100 million into modernising TAFE facilities around the country and scrapping upfront fees for 100,000 TAFE students. We will also reverse the cuts and cap the student places in universities. This will open up around 1,500 places more for McEwen residents to head off to university. We won't stand for the $80 billion being handed to the top end of the town when our universities, TAFEs and budgets are brutally slashed, because we understand education is the key to securing our economy and creating opportunities. For our pensioners, this government's trademark of consistently being out of touch has not left retirees unscathed. You can always rely on this government to take from the needy and give to the rich. That's their trademark. In what world does increasing the pension age while also cutting the pension and energy supplement make sense? Instead of rewarding those who have worked hard for our nation, the government is ripping $14 a week out of their pockets, per fortnight, and telling them they should just have to keep working until they're 70. In McEwen, that's 17,000 residents over the age of 70 that the government's tax cuts will no doubt affect. That's 17,000 nation builders who are worse off under this government's community alone, in my community alone. Australians who have worked hard to enjoy their retirement shouldn't be made to continue to slave away because of the Prime Minister turning his back on them. And of course, healthcare system is no different. Under this government, average waiting times for elective surgery are the longest on record. The number of hospital beds available for elderly Australians is the lowest on record, and the number of people arriving in emergency departments is the highest on record. But instead of fixing this and making healthcare more accessible to Australians, this government has locked further cuts to hospitals from 2020, joining already the ludicrous $715 million cruel cuts they've already got in place. Now, if you make huge cuts to healthcare outcomes are getting worse, what possible argument can be made to double down and cut even more? They're keeping the Medicare rebate freeze in place, meaning families in Mernda, Wallen, Sunbury and Kilmore are going to be forking out their savings just to see a specialist. And seeing a GP is costing families in Romsey and Whittlesea 20% more than it was a couple of years ago. Under Labor's Better Hospital funds, we will invest extra $764 million over the forward estimates to fix our public hospitals. That means that over the next 6 years, we'll be committing an extra $2.8 billion in funding for more beds, shorter waiting times, and we'll invest in every single public hospital across the country. Now, I was out in Whittlesea last week talking to Luscombe Automotive about Labor's plan to give all mechanics access to the technical information that they need to service modern cars. This will expand opportunities for people in our communities to shop locally, supporting local businesses and local people and local jobs. It's so important that in rural and regional areas that we do this to make sure our economies grow and to make sure that we end the scourge of high unemployment, something this government has totally ignored. When we have communities with 42% unemployment for young people, there is not 1 cent put in this budget to actually help them find work or to improve services to allow them to get to work. So, in conclusion, Deputy Speaker, while the Prime Minister sits in his harbourside mansion, content with the havoc he's wreaked on the working middle class, sussing out the latest happenings at Oogland House, Australians like the ones that I have in my community are out there working hard, struggling to make ends meet week in, week out. By now, hard-working Australians know that the economy is not working for them, and the only way to fix this is to remove this Prime Minister, this greedy Treasurer and this government at the next election. Sid Marr and Jared Owens wrote in The Australian back in May 2011, "Senior Liberals have declared that Malcolm Turnbull will never again lead the party." They were right. This Prime Minister does not lead. As I said earlier, the moral test of government is how the government treats those who are at the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadow of life, the sick, the needy and the handicapped. Deputy Speaker, on every moral test, this government and this budget is an absolute failure.